This is the summary of Rebel Witch, The Crimson Moth, Book 2, summarized by Cellwave Audio and narrated by Bill. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial summary and analysis of Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli. It is not the original book and is not affiliated with or authorized by the author or publisher. This work is intended to provide key insights, analysis, and commentary for educational and informational purposes only. All names, trademarks, and references to the original content remain the property of their respective owners. Every effort has been made to ensure fair use under Section 107 of the Copyright Act. Readers are encouraged to purchase the original book from the author or publisher for the full experience and context. Introduction. Kristen Ciccarelli's Rebel Witch is the conclusion to the Crimson Moth duology, a story that unites betrayal, sacrifice, and the search for identity in a world consumed by fear. The novel begins in the aftermath of Rune Winters' exposure as a witch. Once concealed behind the mask of the Crimson Moth, she now faces her enemies in the open with no protection from secrecy. The Republic, founded on fear of witchcraft, continues to hold power through its hunters, but its foundations tremble. Within that weakness lies the ambition of Cressida Roseblood, the dethroned witch queen, who is determined to resurrect the reign of witches and return her kind to power regardless of the cost. Rune is caught between these two forces. Choosing Cressida could secure her survival, but risks restoring a tyranny that once oppressed many. Refusing her means fighting almost alone against overwhelming odds. Her struggle is not only external, but internal as well, for she must endure the grief of lost friends, the scars of betrayal, and the constant weight of choices that blur the line between necessity and morality. Gideon Sharpe, the hunter whose betrayal left Rune exposed, embodies the other side of this conflict. His orders are clear. He must capture or kill the witch who threatens the Republic. Yet his heart remains bound to Rune, and every step he takes is haunted by the memory of what they once shared. Gideon's conflict mirrors the larger struggle of the novel as he wrestles with law against conscience, loyalty against love, and justice against mercy. Together, Rune and Gideon move within a world where alliances shift constantly, where enemies may become partners, and where love itself is tested in the fires of war and ambition. Rebel Witch is more than a tale of witches and hunters. It is a meditation on identity, power, and the choices that shape history. It asks whether love can endure after betrayal, whether survival can exist alongside justice, and whether a new path can be forged in a world haunted by its past. Ciccarelli crafts a world alive with danger and longing, where trust is scarce, and where every decision carries the weight of destiny. This is the landscape upon which the story unfolds, a world poised between ruin and rebirth, demanding courage from those who would dare to shape its future. Chapter 1. Gideon begins in the capital, a soldier known for his loyalty and skill. The Republic relies on him to lead hunts for witches, and he never refuses a command. His reputation has been built on precision and obedience, and his commanders trust him above most others. During one raid, he and his men storm a district suspected of harboring magic. Doors are kicked down, families are pulled into the streets, and the slightest hint of witchcraft is enough to condemn someone. Gideon's blade is steady as he carries out orders, capturing and executing those marked as enemies. To the crowd, he is the Republic's chosen hand of justice. The punishment is swift and brutal. Witches are tied to stakes, their cries ignored as fire rises around them. Gideon watches, ensuring no one escapes, his expression calm before the soldiers and citizens. Yet, behind his silence, the screams echo long after the flames die. Though he walks away appearing untouched, the weight of what he has seen clings to him. He buries the unease, but it lingers. The first sign that not even the Republic's perfect soldier can watch endless executions without carrying the scars. Chapter 2. Rune's world shifts when her quiet life suddenly collides with strange events that force her to confront what she is. She has always felt different, as though a part of her never belonged. But in this chapter, the weight of that difference begins to surface. The whispers about her in the village, the wary looks, and the sense of isolation she carries begin to take clearer shape. People treat her with suspicion, but beneath that judgment lies something deeper, an instinctive recognition that she is not like them. She struggles with this unwanted attention, yet deep down, Rune cannot deny the pull she feels toward something greater than her small life. She senses power within herself, but it frightens her as much as it tempts her. The quiet moments she spends reflecting reveal her inner battle: to remain hidden and safe, or to step into the danger of what she truly is. Her emotions shift between fear and curiosity, and the more she questions, the more restless she becomes. Tension builds when Rune begins to notice signs that she is being watched. A fleeting shadow, the sharp sound of footsteps where none should be, and the way the air seems to grow heavy when she is alone. These details push her unease into fear. She starts doubting her safety, and though she tries to dismiss it as her imagination, the feeling of being hunted refuses to leave her. In a rare moment of stillness, Rune reflects on what she has lost. The life she once dreamed of is gone, and the faces of those who have fallen because of her choices haunt her thoughts. Yet, this grief fuels her determination. She tells herself that every sacrifice must have meaning, and that her survival is not for her own sake, but for the cause she carries. This mix of sorrow and resolve sharpens her into someone both hardened and deeply human. Rune begins to outline the steps she must take next. Messages must be delivered, supplies secured, and allies persuaded. The rebellion is fragile, but she believes it can still burn brighter if she moves quickly and decisively. Every action is weighed against the possibility of discovery, yet Rune knows hesitation could kill the movement before it has a chance to grow. As Rune wrestles with these discoveries, her loneliness cuts deeper. She yearns for someone to understand her, but no one in her world offers that kind of connection. What she does not yet realize is that forces outside her control are already drawing her into a path where she will not be alone for much longer. This chapter paints her vulnerability, her inner strength waiting to break free, and her role as more than just a girl with secrets. She is the beginning of a storm that others have long feared. Chapter 3. Gideon woke restless, the weight of his mission pressing down even before the first light broke over the camp. He sharpened his blade by habit, though he knew steel alone would not be enough for what lay ahead. His orders were clear, yet his instincts whispered that clarity was an illusion. This witch he was meant to hunt was no ordinary fugitive. The Republic feared her not only for her power, but for the way she seemed to inspire others to resist. That thought troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The commander summoned him soon after. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of parchment and oil lamps. The man's gaze was steady, unreadable. "You understand what you must do," he said. Gideon's reply was firm but measured. "I do. Capture her if possible. Kill her if I must." The commander leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do not underestimate her. She has already slipped through our nets more than once. If she escapes again, the Republic will not forgive failure. Gideon held his ground, though the warning rang in his ears long after he left the tent. Outside, the camp stirred with activity. Soldiers polished their armor, tended to horses, and sharpened weapons. To them, it was another day of service, but Gideon felt the eyes of the Republic on his every step. He was not just a soldier now. He was a hunter, chosen for his skill and his reputation for precision. A few comrades offered brief nods as he passed, though none dared speak of the mission aloud. They all knew better. Witches were not common prey, and even hardened men whispered of their cunning. Later, he sought a moment of silence at the edge of the camp. His thoughts drifted to the countless lives already touched by this conflict. Witches were branded as enemies, yet Gideon had begun to notice how their stories were always told through the Republic's tongue. He wondered what truth might lie beyond the orders he was given. Shaking the thought away, he reminded himself that doubts were a soldier's weakness. And yet, the unease lingered, heavy as the sword strapped to his side. That evening, he joined the others for a sparse meal. One younger soldier, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, asked, "Do you think she's as dangerous as they say?" Gideon paused, weighing his words. "Dangerous, yes, but not in the way you think." The boy frowned, confused, but Gideon offered nothing more. He did not speak of the pull he felt in his chest, a strange anticipation that this mission would test more than his skill with a blade. It would test his resolve, perhaps even his loyalty. When night fell, Gideon returned to his tent. The camp quieted, though his thoughts refused to settle. He traced the lines of his weapon, steel glinting faintly in the lamplight, and repeated his orders like a prayer. Capture, if possible. Kill, if necessary. Yet beneath the calm surface of discipline, something stirred, a question he dared not voice. What if the witch was not the monster they claimed her to be? Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was haunted by visions he could not explain. Chapter 4. Preparations for departure began at dawn. Gideon moved through the camp with steady composure, but inwardly he measured every detail. Supplies were loaded, weapons inspected, horses readied. The Republic had handpicked only a small unit to accompany him, men skilled enough to remain silent and disciplined, but few enough to avoid drawing attention. Gideon knew what that meant. This was a mission meant to strike quickly and leave no trace. The commander addressed the group before they set out. His words were sharp, leaving no room for doubt. Your duty is simple. Follow Gideon's lead. Do not question orders. And remember, failure is not an option. The men gave a unified nod, though their eyes betrayed unease. Witches were not ordinary enemies, and even the bravest of them felt the weight of the stories whispered around fires at night. Gideon, catching their hesitation, stepped forward with calm authority. Trust in your training. Stay sharp, and we will finish this task as the Republic demands. The march began under a gray sky, the road stretching before them like a silent warning. The men spoke little, each one guarding his own nerves, but Gideon's thoughts were anything but quiet. He studied the terrain, alert to any sign of movement. Rumors claimed the witch favored secluded paths and villages on the edge of Republic control, where she might find refuge among people too fearful to defy her. He forced himself to focus on the task, though questions gnawed at the back of his mind. By midday, they reached a crossroads where the land opened wide. A scout reported faint tracks leading into the woods, lighter than a soldier's stride, yet distinct enough to follow. The men exchanged wary glances, waiting for Gideon's command. He knelt, studying the impressions in the dirt. She's close, he muttered. Rising, he signaled the unit to advance quietly. Every step into the forest deepened the tension, the air thick with the possibility that she was watching them even now. That night, they made camp in the shelter of the trees. A fire flickered low as the men gathered around it, their voices hushed. One asked cautiously, "Do you believe she'll fight if we corner her?" Gideon considered the question before answering. "She will fight if she has no choice. The danger is not in her power alone, but in her will to survive." The words silenced the group, for they all knew a desperate enemy was the most dangerous of all. Gideon remained awake long after the others had drifted to sleep, listening to the forest as though it might whisper the truth he sought. In the quiet of the night, he felt the weight of expectation pressing harder. This was more than a mission. It was a test of his loyalty, his skill, and perhaps his very understanding of right and wrong. Somewhere ahead was the witch the Republic so feared, and the closer he drew to her trail, the less certain he felt of the path he walked. Chapter 5. The forest thickened as Gideon and his men pressed deeper into the wilderness. The path was narrow, forcing them to ride in a single line, and every snapping twig or shifting shadow made the soldiers tense. Gideon kept his hand close to his weapon, scanning the surroundings with sharp eyes. He was trained to expect ambushes, but what unsettled him most was not the danger of enemy blades. It was the thought that she might already know they were coming, watching their every move from somewhere unseen. By midday, they reached a small clearing where a stream cut through the undergrowth. The men filled their flasks while Gideon knelt to examine the damp earth. He found faint impressions in the mud, delicate but deliberate. A boot print, smaller than a soldier's, pressed into the ground. "She was here," he said quietly, his voice firm enough to command attention. The men gathered around, and though none spoke, the fear in their eyes was clear. The witch was no longer just a rumor. She was real, and she was close. They followed the tracks for hours, moving carefully, until signs of a recent campfire appeared near the roots of an old oak. Ashes still warm, embers faintly glowing. Gideon crouched beside it, brushing his fingers across the soot. "She's ahead of us," he muttered. One soldier broke the silence. "If she knows we're chasing her, why hasn't she run farther?" Gideon straightened, scanning the tree line. "Because she doesn't need to. She knows the forest better than we do." The thought left the men uneasy, but there was no turning back. That night, tension hung heavier than the smoke of their small fire. The soldiers whispered among themselves, their nerves fraying. One of the younger men leaned toward Gideon. "Do you think she's like the stories? The kind that steals minds or bends fire?" Gideon's eyes met his. Stories are always larger than the truth. But truth can be dangerous enough. He left it at that, unwilling to feed the boy's fear. The silence that followed said more than words could. As the camp settled, Gideon sat apart, sharpening his blade beneath the moonlight. His thoughts were restless, circling the same question. What kind of person was this witch? The Republic painted her as a threat to order, but he wondered what pushed her onto this path. Was she truly the monster they claimed, or was there more to her story? The doubt was dangerous, but he could not shake it. Before dawn, a sound stirred him awake, a branch snapping too cleanly to be the wind. He rose silently, hand on his weapon, and scanned the darkness. For an instant, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the trees. A shadow, quick and fluid, disappearing as fast as it came. Gideon did not chase it. Instead, He whispered to himself, "She's closer than ever." And with that, the hunt grew sharper, the line between predator and prey beginning to blur. Chapter 6. The next day's march was slower, weighed down by the sense that every step forward brought them into enemy ground. The forest canopy grew denser, shrouding them in shadows that felt alive with unseen eyes. Gideon kept his men moving quietly, hand signals replacing words, but he could feel their unease growing. He himself was not free of it. Each crackle of leaves seemed louder than it should have been, each bird call sharper, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Smoke drifted faintly from its center, too thin to be natural mist. Gideon crouched low, gesturing for the men to follow his lead. From their vantage point, he spotted signs of habitation: a hidden fire pit, cloth stretched between trees, and what looked like the remnants of hastily prepared meals. His suspicions hardened. "She's been here," he said quietly. A few men shifted nervously, gripping their weapons tighter. They descended carefully, spreading out as they neared the abandoned site. Gideon inspected the ground, noting the scatter of footprints, not only hers but others. Villagers, perhaps, or sympathizers. He frowned at the discovery, aware that this made her pursuit more complicated. She was not alone. "She's drawing help," he said, his voice low but certain. "Every day we wait, her reach grows stronger." The soldiers glanced at one another, worry flashing in their eyes. The men searched the camp for signs of where she had gone. One soldier lifted a piece of cloth, charred at the edges, muttering that it could have been used in a ritual. Another found herbs bundled neatly, suggesting she had left in haste. Gideon remained silent, taking in the details. None of this felt careless. She wanted them to find this place, to know they were close. It was bait, meant to unsettle them, and he knew it was working. That evening, they set camp a short distance away. The soldiers ate in silence, their nerves frayed. One of them finally broke. "Sir, what if she's leading us into a trap?" Gideon looked up from the fire. "Then we step into it with our eyes open. She wants us to be uneasy. Don't give her that power." His tone was firm, but inside he wrestled with the truth of the man's words. The witch's cunning was undeniable, and the more they followed her, the more it felt as if she was controlling the chase. When the camp quieted, Gideon remained awake, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His gaze lingered on the trees beyond, where shadows moved with the wind. He thought again of the footprints, the signs of allies, and the unsettling possibility that the Republic had not told him everything. A whisper of doubt stirred within him. Perhaps this was more than a hunt. Perhaps he was being drawn into something far greater, something that would change him in ways he could not yet see. Chapter 7. The rain had eased by morning, leaving the forest damp and heavy with mist. Rune stirred awake to the sound of Gideon sharpening his blade, the rhythmic scrape filling the quiet. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, shivering slightly as the cold sank into her bones. Gideon glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, before returning to his work. It struck her how steady he always seemed, how his movements carried no wasted effort. Rune hated to admit even to herself that there was something comforting in that steadiness. She pushed the thought aside and rose to her feet. They set off without a word, their boots sinking into the soft, wet earth. Rune followed close behind Gideon, watching the way he scanned their surroundings with constant vigilance. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Do you ever get tired of always being on guard?" Gideon didn't look back. "The day I grow tired is the day I die." His answer was sharp, but not unkind. Rune frowned, thinking of the years she had spent hiding, fighting, surviving. Perhaps they were not so different after all, though she would never say it aloud. As they moved deeper into the woods, the mist thickened, curling around the trees and shrouding the path. Suddenly, a noise broke through the stillness of the snap of a twig. Rune froze, her hand slipping to the dagger hidden at her side. Gideon raised his hand, signaling for silence. They both crouched low, listening as the faint sound of voices drifted through the fog. Soldiers. Rune's pulse quickened, anger burning beneath her skin. She wanted to strike, to prove she was no helpless fugitive. But before she could move, Gideon's hand clamped firmly around her wrist. His eyes met hers, sharp and commanding. "Not now," he mouthed. Reluctantly, she stilled. They crouched there in silence as the patrol passed by, their armor clinking softly in the mist. Rune could feel Gideon's grip on her wrist, strong yet steady, holding her back from the reckless impulse that burned in her chest. When the danger finally moved on, he released her slowly, his gaze lingering on her face, as if to make sure she had truly understood the lesson. Rune yanked her hand away, her voice sharp. "I don't need your protection." Gideon's reply came quietly, but firmly. "Then stop acting like you do." His words cut deeper than she expected, leaving her silent. By midday, the mist began to thin, revealing a narrow path winding through thorn-covered undergrowth. Rune walked ahead for once, her thoughts restless. She hated the way Gideon's presence unsettled her, and hated that she noticed the way he carried himself, the way his eyes seemed to see everything. But she could not deny that he had saved her more than once, and part of her feared what would happen if he wasn't there. That fear tasted bitter, like weakness, and she clenched her jaw against it. Gideon, walking a step behind, seemed to sense her storm of emotions, but said nothing. Later, they reached a sheltered hollow where the earth dipped low, hidden from view. Gideon motioned for them to stop and rest. Rune sank against the trunk of a tree, exhausted, her body aching from the long march. Gideon sat across from her, his blade resting on his knees. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Rune broke the silence, her voice low. "Why do you keep helping me? You could have left me a dozen times by now." Gideon's gaze stayed steady, his voice calm. "Because leaving you would mean failing myself." Rune blinked, startled by the weight in his words. She wanted to press him, but the fire in his eyes told her the subject was closed. When night fell, they lit a small, hidden fire, its glow faint against the dark. Rune sat close enough to feel its warmth, her eyes fixed on the flames. Gideon kept watch, his hand never straying far from his weapon. For once, Rune did not argue or push him with questions. The silence between them felt different now. Not hostile, not heavy, but cautious, as though both of them were slowly testing the fragile thread of trust weaving itself between them. And as the fire crackled quietly, Rune found herself wondering whether this dangerous alliance might become something far more complicated than either of them intended. Chapter 8. Rune woke with a start, her senses sharpening to the faint sounds of the forest at dawn. The air was cold, carrying the smell of damp earth, and every shadow seemed alive with danger. Gideon was already awake, standing a few steps away with his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. His eyes swept the trees as if he expected enemies to emerge at any moment. Rune watched him for a moment, her thoughts restless. He was supposed to be her enemy, the one sworn to destroy witches like her. Yet here he was, guarding her sleep. When his gaze shifted toward her, she looked away quickly, not wanting him to see how much she noticed. They began their march before the sun had fully risen, moving quickly through the thinning woods. The silence between them stretched tight until Rune broke it with a sharp question. "Do you always wake before dawn like some hound on duty?" she asked. Gideon did not even glance at her. "A hound lives longer when it listens for danger." His reply was curt, but she caught the hint of dry humor beneath it. She almost smiled but bit it back, unwilling to let him think she found him amusing. Still, his presence beside her steadied her in a way she did not want to admit. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Rune's mind circled back to everything she had lost. The Republic had taken her family, her people, her home. Now all that remained was her fight to survive. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down too heavily, and Gideon must have seen it in her face. He slowed his steps and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "Do not let them strip away your spirit, too." "They fear what they cannot control." Rune froze at his words, startled that he, of all people, would say such a thing. She looked at him sharply, searching for mockery, but found only a weary honesty in his eyes. By midday, they reached a narrow stream. Rune knelt to drink, watching the water ripple around her hands. "Do you think we will ever stop running?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon crouched beside her, his broad frame casting a shadow over the water. "Not until one of us ends it," he said. His words should have chilled her, but instead they sparked a strange sense of resolve. Rune realized then that he had not abandoned her, even when he had every reason to. For all his gruffness, he had chosen to walk beside her when leaving her behind would have been the safer path. The forest soon gave way to stretches of open meadow, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in pale bands. Rune lifted her face to the warmth, savoring it, but Gideon's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. He was always calculating, always ready. At one point their hands brushed as they climbed over a fallen log. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but the heat of it lingered in Rune's chest far longer than she wished. She glanced at him, and for once his gaze flicked toward her too, a moment of awareness passing between them before they both turned away. As the day wore on, danger returned. A group of Republic soldiers appeared in the distance, their crimson insignias catching the light. Rune's heart thudded painfully, but Gideon's grip on her arm steadied her. "Stay low," he whispered. They crouched together in the tall grass, waiting as the patrol passed. Rune could feel the tension in him, the steady control that kept them both alive. When the soldiers finally disappeared, she let out a shaky breath. Gideon's hand lingered on her arm for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he released her. That small gesture said more than words could. By nightfall, they found a crumbling outpost hidden under ivy and vines. Rune leaned against the broken stone wall, exhaustion pulling at her body. Gideon built a small fire, his movements careful and deliberate, as if every step of the task gave him purpose. Rune studied him across the flames, wondering what lay behind his unshakable guard. For the first time since their uneasy alliance began, she allowed herself to believe she might not be entirely alone. The thought was dangerous, but it stayed with her as sleep crept in, softening the edges of her fear. Chapter 9. The night inside the ruined outpost was uneasy. Rune drifted in and out of sleep, the flicker of the small fire casting shifting shadows along the broken walls. Every sound outside seemed louder than it should have been: the hoot of an owl, the distant snap of branches, the faint rush of wind through the trees. She turned once and caught Gideon awake, still seated by the fire with his sword resting across his knees. He had not slept at all. Rune studied the line of his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. He was a man driven by discipline, but beneath that, she sensed a weariness he refused to admit. At dawn, they left the safety of the outpost and pressed on, the air cool and sharp with the coming of rain. Gideon kept his pace steady, his eyes trained on the horizon, while Rune trailed close behind. The silence stretched between them until Rune finally spoke. "You do not trust me, yet you have not left me." "Why?" Gideon did not break stride. "Because leaving you would mean handing you over to the Republic, and I will not give them that satisfaction." His words surprised her. They were not the admission of trust she had expected, but something else, something heavier resentment not toward her, but toward the very order he had sworn to serve. By midday the clouds broke, and rain fell hard, soaking them both as they struggled along the muddy path. Rune's cloak clung to her, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but she kept moving. At one point, she slipped on the slope of a hill, nearly tumbling into the ravine below, but Gideon's arm shot out, steadying her before she fell. She looked up at him, breathless, the rain dripping from his brow into his eyes. For a moment, they were too close, the heat of his hand on her arm impossible to ignore. Rune tore her gaze away, muttering, "I could have managed." Gideon gave no reply, but he did not let go until he was sure her footing was secure. The rain did little to hide the danger ahead. As the storm cleared, they spotted smoke rising in the distance. A village burned, its ruins scattered across the valley. Rune stiffened at the sight, her stomach twisting at the familiar cruelty of the Republic. Charred beams and collapsed roofs were all that remained, and the silence of the place was heavier than any battlefield. She walked among the ruins slowly, her fingers brushing the scorched walls, her throat tight with grief. Gideon followed at a distance, his expression unreadable, though Rune saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes. "This is what your Republic does," she whispered bitterly. He did not argue. They moved on from the ruins in silence, but the image stayed with them both. Rune's anger simmered into a quiet resolve, strengthening the fire within her. Gideon seemed caught between duty and regret, the weight of his role pressing harder than before. As night approached, they found shelter beneath a rocky outcrop. Rune gathered twigs for a small fire, while Gideon kept watch, their movements deliberate, as though neither wished to break the fragile quiet between them. When Rune finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "You cannot serve two masters forever. One day you will have to choose." Gideon looked at her then, his gaze sharp yet shadowed with doubt. "You speak as though the choice is easy." Rune met his eyes, refusing to look away. "It never is. But it will come for you, as it came for me." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the restless wind around them. Gideon did not answer, but Rune could see the conflict stirring behind his calm exterior. She knew then that his loyalty to the Republic was no longer unshakable, and that thought unsettled her more than it should have. Later, when she finally lay down to rest, Rune found her thoughts drifting back to the brief touch of his hand earlier in the rain. It lingered in her memory far longer than she wanted, pulling at her in ways she could not control. She closed her eyes, torn between the anger that fueled her fight and the strange comfort she found in his presence. Sleep came slowly, leaving her caught between fear of the future and the dangerous bond forming in the shadows of their journey. Chapter 10. The morning came with a gray, heavy sky that promised another storm. Rune stirred awake to find Gideon already packing his gear, his movements precise and steady. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the hard ground, and watched him for a moment. He noticed, but said nothing, only handing her a piece of dried bread, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Rune accepted it without thanks, chewing quietly as her eyes lingered on him. The silence between them was less hostile now, though it still carried the weight of unspoken questions. They set out once more, crossing uneven ground covered in brambles and thick weeds. Gideon led the way, his eyes sweeping the path ahead, while Rune stayed close enough to match his pace. After a while, she broke the silence. "You never rest, do you?" Gideon glanced over his shoulder. "Rest is a luxury for those who are not hunted." The words carried no sharpness, only a quiet truth. Rune fell silent again, though part of her wanted to push further, to pry open the guarded wall he kept around himself. She hated that she cared to know more, but something about him kept drawing her attention. As they reached a clearing, the quiet of the forest shattered. Voices echoed ahead, soldiers of the Republic moving in small groups, their armor glinting faintly in the light. Rune tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the dagger hidden in her cloak. Gideon reacted quickly, pulling her down into the tall grass before she could move. "Not now," he whispered firmly. "We are outnumbered." Rune bristled at being restrained, but the seriousness in his eyes stilled her. They crouched together in the damp grass as the patrol passed dangerously close, every step heavy with the risk of discovery. When the last soldier disappeared into the trees, Rune let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Once the danger had passed, they moved swiftly and in silence until they reached a safe distance. Rune broke the quiet first. "You could have let me fight." Gideon stopped and turned to face her. "And get yourself killed? That would serve no one." She narrowed her eyes, but beneath her annoyance, she felt an odd warmth in his words. It was not the warning of a soldier to a prisoner, but the concern of someone unwilling to see her fall. The thought unsettled her more than the soldiers ever could. By the time they reached a small grove, exhaustion pressed hard on both of them. Rune leaned against a tree, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her breath. Gideon approached, his voice low but firm. "You must learn when to hold back. Power wasted on the wrong fight leaves you empty when it matters most." Rune frowned, unwilling to admit he was right. "And you, soldier? Do you never burn out? Do you never falter?" His gaze lingered on her before he answered. "More than you think. But I cannot afford to show it." The honesty in his words caught her off guard, softening something inside her she wished would stay hardened. As the day wore on, their path grew harder, winding through tangled roots and sharp rocks. Rune stumbled once, catching herself on a branch, and Gideon immediately reached out to steady her. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment neither looked away. The closeness, the brush of his hand against hers, left an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Rune broke it by muttering, "I can manage on my own." Gideon's lips curved slightly, almost a smile. "You say that every time, and every time you prove me right." Rune turned away quickly, unwilling to let him see the heat rising in her cheeks. When night fell, they built a small fire hidden under the cover of trees. Rune sat across from him, staring at the flames, as the crackle filled the silence. At last, she asked the question that had been circling her thoughts. "If you were ordered to kill me right now, would you obey?" Gideon's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he did not answer. Finally, his voice came low and steady. "I follow orders when they align with what is right. But some orders are not worth carrying out." Rune held his gaze, her heart thudding with an emotion she could not name. In that silence, the firelight caught the sharp lines of his face, and for the first time, She wondered if the man she had called her enemy might one day be her greatest ally. Chapter 11. The night air was heavy with the scent of smoke and iron when Rune and Gideon finally reached the outskirts of the abandoned stronghold. The ruins loomed against the dark sky, half swallowed by creeping vines and broken stone. Rune's steps slowed as she studied the jagged towers, her chest tightening with unease. This was no ordinary ruin. It carried the weight of bloodshed, of battles long buried but not forgotten. Gideon moved ahead, steady as always, though Rune noticed the way his hand lingered near the hilt of his sword. He did not trust the silence, and neither did she. They entered through what had once been a gate, the rusted bars torn down long ago. The courtyard lay in shadows, the stones cracked and overgrown with weeds. Rune's eyes flicked toward every corner, expecting movement, though none came. "This place feels wrong," she murmured, her voice low. Gideon glanced back at her, his tone calm but firm. Danger often hides in silence. Rune scowled, unwilling to admit he was right. She tightened her grip on her dagger, the familiar weight offering a sliver of comfort as they pressed deeper inside. As they explored the main hall, the remnants of grandeur still clung faintly to the broken pillars and shattered glass. Rune brushed her fingers across the scarred stone, imagining the lives that had once filled this place. Suddenly, the sound of metal striking stone echoed through the chamber. She spun around, blade in hand, but Gideon was faster, stepping in front of her with his sword raised. From the shadows, figures emerged, soldiers, their armor dull but their eyes sharp. A dozen, at least, surrounding them before escape could be considered. Rune's heart pounded, anger flaring hot. "You led us into a trap," she hissed at Gideon. He didn't flinch. "No," he answered quietly. "They were waiting for us." The soldiers advanced, weapons drawn, and Rune felt the raw pulse of her magic itching beneath her skin. She wanted to unleash it, to make them pay, but Gideon's voice cut through her thoughts. "Not yet. Follow my lead." His tone carried command, not suggestion. And though Rune bristled, something in his steadiness made her pause. When the first soldier lunged, Gideon moved like lightning, blade flashing as he blocked the strike. Rune darted to the side, slashing her dagger across another's arm, the thrill of combat rushing through her veins. For a brief moment, it was not survival that drove her, but the strange exhilaration of fighting beside someone who matched her step for step. The clash of steel rang through the ruins, echoing off the stone walls. Rune ducked under a blade, twisting to drive her dagger upward, while Gideon's sword carved through the air with brutal precision. Despite their numbers, the soldiers struggled to keep pace with the ferocity of their resistance. Rune felt a surge of pride in herself, and, begrudgingly, in Gideon. At one point, when a soldier nearly caught her off guard, Gideon's arm shot out, dragging her back just in time. Their eyes locked for a brief, breathless second, and Rune caught herself staring longer than she should have. "Focus," he growled, pushing her forward, and she tore her gaze away, furious at herself for the slip. Finally, the last soldier fell, his weapon clattering against the stones. The silence that followed was sharp, broken only by their ragged breathing. Rune wiped blood from her cheek, her pulse still racing from the fight. Gideon stood a few steps away, his chest rising and falling heavily, his sword still in hand. For a moment, they only stared at each other, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. Rune was the first to break the silence. "We make a dangerous pair." Her voice was edged with defiance, but there was something softer hidden beneath. Gideon's mouth curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Dangerous is the only way we survive. As they gathered themselves to move on, Rune felt a shift she could not ignore. Fighting alongside Gideon had stirred something unexpected, something that unsettled her more than the battle itself. She wanted to dismiss it, to bury it beneath anger and mistrust. Yet it lingered all the same. The stronghold no longer felt like an empty ruin. It felt like the stage for something larger, something neither of them could yet name. And though Rune would never admit it aloud, she knew that from this moment onward, their paths were no longer just entwined by necessity. They were bound by blood, fire, and the dangerous trust forged in the heart of battle. Chapter 12. The path deeper into the stronghold revealed a staircase leading below ground, its steps cracked and half buried in dust. Rune paused at the top, her instincts whispering caution. She could feel the air change, as if the shadows themselves breathed beneath the stone. Gideon moved to descend without hesitation, but Rune caught his arm. "You don't even know what's down there," she said. He looked back at her, his voice low and steady. "That's why we need to see." Their gazes held for a long moment, before Rune released him with a sharp exhale, muttering under her breath about stubborn men as she followed him down. The descent was suffocating, the narrow walls closing in around them. Rune traced her fingers along the stone, feeling grooves etched with strange symbols. They glowed faintly at her touch, sending a jolt through her veins that made her shiver. Gideon noticed, his hand moving closer to his sword. "Magic," he murmured. Rune's lips pressed into a thin line. "Old magic. Whoever built this place meant for it to be guarded." The unease in her chest thickened, but she pushed forward, refusing to let fear show. She would not give Gideon the satisfaction of seeing her falter. At the bottom, they entered a vast chamber lit only by the flicker of torches that had no right to still be burning. In the center stood an altar of dark stone, its surface marred by deep cuts, as though blades had struck it countless times. Rune froze, her heart hammering. "This isn't just a ruin," she whispered. "It's a sanctuary. Or a prison." Gideon stepped beside her, studying the altar with narrowed eyes. "Whatever it is, someone wanted it hidden." His tone carried weight, as though he sensed the same invisible thread that now tugged at Rune's very bones. As they drew nearer, a sudden voice echoed through the chamber, deep and laced with menace. "You should not have come." The shadows rippled, and from them emerged a figure cloaked in black, his presence radiating power that made Rune's magic bristle like fire beneath her skin. Gideon immediately shifted into a defensive stance, sword raised. Rune felt her hand twitch toward her dagger, but she knew steel alone would not be enough here. The cloaked man's eyes glowed faintly, and Rune felt as though they pierced straight into her soul. "You carry what is forbidden," he hissed, though his gaze never left her. The confrontation escalated quickly. The figure lifted a hand, and the chamber quaked, the altar flaring with unnatural light. Rune staggered, clutching her head as whispers clawed at her mind. Gideon caught her before she fell, his voice cutting through the storm. "Rune! Stay with me." She forced her eyes open, focusing on his face instead of the chaos swirling around them. Rage steadied her trembling hands. "I am not afraid of you," she spat at the cloaked figure, and with a surge of will, she unleashed a burst of magic that struck the ground in a wave of flame. The shadows recoiled, and the figure stumbled back, snarling. The fight that followed was unlike the skirmish above. Rune's magic clashed against the dark power that filled the chamber, fire and shadow twisting through the air with violent force. Gideon fought to protect her, intercepting attacks when she faltered, but even he seemed pushed to his limits. Their movements fell into rhythm again, Rune's fire forcing openings while Gideon's sword struck with lethal precision. At one point, when Rune nearly lost control of the flames, Gideon's voice pulled her back. "Breathe. Don't let it own you," his words anchored her, and together they drove the figure back until he finally dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his laughter behind. The silence that followed felt heavier than the battle itself. Rune fell to her knees, her strength spent, sweat beading across her brow. Gideon knelt beside her, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You saved us," he said quietly. Rune shook her head, her voice hoarse. "No, that was only the beginning." She lifted her gaze toward the altar, its glow fading but not gone. Something inside it still pulsed with life, something ancient and dangerous. Gideon followed her stare, his jaw tightening. "Then we know what we're fighting for." Rune didn't answer, but she felt the truth of his words settle inside her. The chamber had revealed more than secrets. It had bound her fate tighter to his. She hated the thought of needing anyone, especially Gideon. Yet in that moment, she could not deny the unspoken bond forged in fire and shadow. Her magic still trembled within her, aching from the strain, but her heart burned with something she dared not name. The ruins had tried to break her, yet instead they had carved something new, something far more dangerous. Trust, fragile but undeniable, between a rebel witch and the man who refused to leave her side. Chapter 13. The following day brought with it a strange calm, as though the storm had washed the forest clean, yet left behind a sharper edge to the air. Gideon was up before the others, his armor already fastened and his sword at his side. Rune emerged not long after, brushing strands of damp hair from her face as she scanned the trees. Neither spoke at first, but the silence was heavy with thoughts unspoken. Gideon's gaze lingered on her for a moment, then turned away, as if he had forced himself to remember she was still the witch he had been sent to capture. Rune caught the hesitation and almost laughed at it. His determination to see her as nothing more than his enemy was beginning to crack. Their journey continued deeper into the wilderness, the path narrowing until it forced them closer together. Rune walked with deliberate ease, but her eyes missed nothing. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of the shadows was noted, her instincts honed by years of survival. Gideon saw the sharpness in her and grudgingly admitted she was more than he had first believed. She was not only surviving, she was leading in her own way. At one point, when the men stumbled over a hidden ditch, Rune's quick warning kept them from tumbling into it. Gideon glanced at her, their eyes meeting briefly, and though no words were exchanged, the acknowledgement was there. By midday, they reached the ruins of an abandoned watchtower, its stones half collapsed and covered with vines. Gideon ordered a halt, deciding it was safer to rest here than in the open trail. Rune wandered through the remains, her fingers trailing lightly over the weathered stone, as though she could feel the memories clinging to it. Gideon followed her with cautious steps, unsettled by the almost reverent way she studied the ruin. "Places like this remember things," she murmured, not looking at him. He frowned. "They're just rocks." Rune's lips curved faintly. "Not to me." Her tone carried a weight that silenced him, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered what it was like to see the world through her eyes. As evening settled, Gideon kept watch while the others slept. Rune sat nearby, her cloak wrapped around her shoulders, but her eyes never left him. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Why do you follow the Republic so blindly? You don't strike me as the kind of man who enjoys chains, Gideon did not look at her, his voice steady. Because without order, there is nothing but chaos, and chaos destroys more than any one witch could. Rune tilted her head, studying him as though peeling away his defenses. Or maybe it's easier to obey than to ask who benefits from the chains you wear. The fire crackled between them, each word deepening the gulf that lay alongside the strange pull drawing them closer. Later in the night, when Rune finally lay down, she closed her eyes, but sleep refused to come. Gideon's words echoed in her mind, clashing with her own. She thought of the Republic's soldiers burning villages, of the chains placed on those who had magic, and she wondered if Gideon truly believed his own justifications, or if he spoke them only to silence doubts in himself. She wanted to believe him blind, yet the way he listened to her, the way his gaze lingered longer than it should, told her he was not untouched by doubt. That knowledge unsettled her more than his blade ever could. The hours passed, and with them the weight of their unspoken thoughts grew heavier. Rune shifted restlessly, pulling her cloak tighter around her. At last, when she thought Gideon had drifted off, she heard his voice, low and quiet. "You see chains. I see duty." Maybe they're the same thing, her breath caught. But she did not reply, keeping her eyes shut as though asleep. The words dug deep into her, challenging her certainty, forcing her to face questions she had long buried. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she couldn't easily name. Not trust, not yet, but a recognition she couldn't deny. When dawn broke, the ruins stood silent behind them as they set off again. Rune walked at Gideon's side, neither speaking, yet the space between them thrummed with the weight of the night before. The journey stretched on, the forest swallowing them once more, but something had shifted. Rune no longer saw only an enemy at her side, and Gideon no longer walked beside just a witch. What that meant, neither was ready to face, but the path ahead would give them little choice. Chapter 14. The morning light filtered weakly through the trees as the group pressed deeper into enemy-controlled lands. Every sound seemed magnified, from the snapping of twigs under their boots to the caw of crows overhead. Rune walked with her head slightly bowed, her senses alert to the subtle tremors of magic hidden beneath the surface of the world. Gideon marched beside her, his hand resting near the hilt of his sword, scanning the path with a soldier's discipline. Though neither spoke much, their awareness of each other had sharpened since the night at the ruins. Rune could feel the shift, a tension humming in the silence between them. It unsettled her as much as it steadied her, for Gideon was still a threat, yet not as simple as she once believed. As the hours wore on, the forest gave way to marshy ground. The air grew heavy with dampness, and the stench of decay clung to their clothes. Rune moved carefully, warning the others where the earth was too soft. Gideon watched the way she guided them, with a quiet authority that contradicted the Republic's portrait of witches as reckless destroyers. He hated that part of him, respected her instincts. More than once, when one of the soldiers faltered, it was Rune's quick thinking that kept them from sinking knee-deep into the mire. Gideon said nothing, but his silence was its own kind of acknowledgement. Rune noticed, and though she did not comment, a flicker of satisfaction crossed her expression. By midday, they reached a patch of higher ground, where gnarled trees twisted upward like skeletal hands. The men settled for a short rest, but Rune's attention was caught by strange markings carved into one of the trunks. She traced them with her fingers, her voice low. These are old words. Whoever placed them wanted to keep something out, or in. Gideon stepped closer, studying the faded lines. Do they still hold? Rune shook her head. No, time has weakened them, but the intent remains. Her words hung in the air, a warning none of them could ignore. For Gideon, it was a reminder that the world he thought he knew was layered with mysteries the Republic had taught him to dismiss. Later, as they resumed their march, Rune's unease grew. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, a prickling at the back of her neck that spoke of danger. Gideon noticed the way her steps slowed, her gaze darting to the shadows. "What is it?" he asked under his breath. Rune's reply was tense. "We're being watched." He stiffened, giving subtle orders to the men to ready themselves without drawing attention. Moments later, the forest erupted with movement as a band of hunters sprang from hiding, their weapons gleaming, their faces painted with the symbols of those who hunted witches for coins. Rune's pulse surged, her instincts flaring. Gideon drew his blade, stepping in front of her even before she moved. The clash was swift and brutal. Steel rang against steel, and the cries of the hunters echoed through the trees. Rune called upon her magic, weaving bursts of flame and shadow to push their attackers back. Gideon fought beside her, his sword a blur as he cut down those who came too close. For a moment, it was as though they moved as one, her power and his strength interlocking in a rhythm neither had planned. The hunters had expected an easy kill, but instead they found themselves overwhelmed by the unlikely alliance. When the last of them fled into the woods, the ground was littered with broken weapons and groans of the wounded. As the adrenaline ebbed, Gideon stood breathing heavily, his armor marked with cuts and blood. Rune wiped her hands, her magic still humming in her veins. Their eyes met across the chaos, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition forged in the crucible of survival. One of Gideon's men muttered in disbelief, "We'd be dead without her." Gideon silenced him with a sharp look, but inwardly he could not deny the truth. Rune had saved them all, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily on him. It was a blow to the foundation of everything he had been taught to believe. That night, as they camped in uneasy silence, Rune sat apart from the others, staring into the fire. She felt the distance of their eyes on her, a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Gideon joined her after a while, lowering himself beside her with deliberate calm. For a long moment he said nothing, then finally spoke. "You didn't have to fight for us." Rune's voice was steady, though her gaze stayed on the flames. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I refused to die on someone else's terms." Gideon studied her profile, the firelight painting her features in sharp relief. He realized then that she was not merely his prisoner, nor a symbol of the Republic's fear, but a force that could not be bound by chains or decrees. The thought unsettled him more than any battle ever had. Chapter 15. The following morning began under a veil of tension. The camp was slow to stir, the men still weary from the ambush, their eyes darting toward the shadows of the forest, as though expecting another attack. Rune moved quietly, wrapping her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She could still feel the echo of her magic coursing faintly beneath her skin, restless and alive. Gideon oversaw the preparations with a stern efficiency, but Rune noted the way he glanced in her direction more often than before, as though measuring something within her that unsettled him. Their fragile alliance had been tested, and though it held, the cracks of mistrust were still visible beneath the surface. As they pressed forward, the terrain shifted again. The marshland gave way to dry, rocky paths that wound upward into cliffs overlooking the valleys below. The air was clearer here, but the climb was difficult, and tempers grew short among the soldiers. Rune kept pace easily, her presence at times infuriatingly calm to those who still doubted her. Gideon, however, found himself caught between two instincts: to distrust her, as the Republic demanded, or to recognize the value of her resilience. He chose silence, knowing words spoken too freely could unravel the fragile balance they had. Rune noticed, but said nothing, choosing instead to save her breath for the climb. By midday, they reached a narrow ridge where the wind howled with relentless force. The group paused to catch their breath, but Rune was restless. Her eyes scanned the horizon, where faint shapes moved across the distant hills. She leaned toward Gideon, her voice low. "We're not alone." He followed her gaze, narrowing his eyes until he caught sight of riders approaching swiftly. The sight turned his stomach. "Scouts from the Republic," he muttered. Rune stiffened. "Your people?" Gideon's expression darkened. "Not mine. They'll kill us both if they discover who you are." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, underscoring how precarious their situation truly was. The soldiers scrambled to prepare, pulling weapons and finding cover along the rocks. Rune pressed her hand against the stone, whispering words in a tongue Gideon didn't understand. The ground beneath their feet shivered faintly as her power seeped into it. When the riders drew near, Gideon raised his sword, shouting orders with a commander's authority. The clash that followed was brutal and desperate. Rune unleashed her magic in bursts of flame that scattered their enemies, while Gideon met them with the unyielding force of his blade. Together, they carved through the scouts, but it was not without cost. Several of Gideon's men were wounded, and blood stained the rocky ground. When the last rider fell, silence returned in broken waves. Rune stood breathing heavily, her hair loose around her face, her hands still crackling faintly with residual magic. Gideon looked at her, his chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking his brow. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rune said softly, "This will only get worse. They will not stop hunting us." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I know." He wanted to add more, to confess the doubts that gnawed at him, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he busied himself with tending to the wounded, though his eyes betrayed the storm raging within. That evening, the group camped along the ridge, the setting sun casting long shadows across the stone. The men were quieter than before, shaken by the encounter and by the sight of Rune's magic wielded so openly. Some regarded her with open fear, others with reluctant gratitude. Rune sat apart, her face drawn, exhaustion tugging at her features. Gideon approached after a long hesitation, carrying a water skin. He held it out, his voice gruff. "Drink." Rune accepted it without comment, their hands brushing briefly as it passed between them. The contact lingered in Gideon's mind longer than it should have, a spark he could not ignore. As night deepened, the silence between them shifted into something heavier. Rune finally spoke, her tone quieter than the crackling fire. "You don't trust me. And you shouldn't. But you need me if you want to survive this." Gideon met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know." For once, there was no accusation in his voice, only weary honesty. Rune turned back to the fire, a faint smirk touching her lips, though her eyes were shadowed. They were enemies, bound together by circumstance, and yet, in moments like these, the lines between them blurred in ways neither could control. Chapter 16. The morning after the ambush was heavy with unease. The soldiers moved quietly, still shaken by the bloodshed, and many cast wary glances at Rune as though she might turn her magic against them at any moment. Gideon noticed it all, though he said nothing, his face carved in stone as he gave commands. Rune did not flinch beneath their eyes, though she felt the weight of their mistrust. She kept her hood drawn low, and her hands steady at her sides. Gideon was careful to keep her close, not out of comfort, but because he knew that fear could drive desperate men to reckless choices. His presence beside her was a warning, and perhaps, though he would not admit it, a shield. The path ahead wound downward into a valley where the ruins of an old watchtower stood. It was there Gideon ordered them to rest, though his reasons went beyond exhaustion. He wanted higher ground and the advantage of stone walls, no matter how broken. As the men secured the area, Rune wandered toward the edge of the ruins, her eyes sweeping over the land below. "You've brought them into a trap," she murmured. Gideon stiffened. "It's not a trap. It's a cover." Rune's lips curved faintly, as though amused by his attempt at control. "You always think in terms of soldiers and walls, but the Republic hunts differently than you expect. They will send more, and when they come, walls won't save us." Her words haunted him as night fell. Around the campfires the men muttered, the glow casting long shadows over their uneasy faces. Rune sat apart, humming a melody so soft only Gideon, seated nearby, could hear it. It was not a soldier's song, but something older, something that reminded him of places he had never seen. For reasons he could not explain, it settled some of the restlessness that plagued him. "What are you singing?" he asked finally. Rune tilted her head, her eyes catching the firelight. "A lullaby. My mother used to sing it when storms rattled the roof." Gideon looked away, suddenly feeling as though she had given him something too fragile to hold. Their peace was short-lived. Near midnight, a whistle pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable rumble of hooves. The scouts had returned, and this time they brought more soldiers. Chaos erupted as arrows rained down, forcing the camp to scramble. Gideon leapt to his feet, barking orders, while Rune's eyes blazed with fire. She lifted her hands, and the ground itself seemed to split, swallowing several of their attackers in a sudden crack of stone. Men shouted in terror at the sight, and Gideon felt his chest tighten. Her power was terrifying, destructive, and yet it was the only reason they survived the onslaught. The battle dragged on until the Republic forces retreated, leaving behind the fallen and the wounded. The ruins were splattered with blood, and the smell of smoke hung thick in the night. Gideon stood among the carnage, his sword heavy in his hand, his muscles aching. Across from him, Rune lowered her arms slowly, her breath coming in harsh bursts. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, silence bound them. Gideon did not thank her, but the look in his eyes betrayed something else. Reluctant recognition, perhaps even respect. Rune read it easily and turned away, hiding the tremor of exhaustion in her body. When dawn came, the camp was subdued. The men treated their wounds in silence, and though many still eyed Rune with suspicion, none dared speak against her openly. They had seen what she could do, and fear had shifted into something resembling awe. Gideon approached her as she sat apart, staring into the rising sun. "You fought like a demon," he said, his tone neutral, though his words carried weight. Rune smirked faintly. "And you fought like a man who would rather die than admit he needs help." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. For once, they shared something close to a truce. As they broke camp and prepared to move on, Gideon felt the burden of command pressing heavier than before. Rune walked ahead, her cloak fluttering behind her, and he followed with a mixture of unease and fascination. She was still the witch he had been sent to capture, still the threat to the Republic he had sworn to protect. Yet each step they took together made that truth harder to hold on to. What gnawed at him most was not her power, but the growing realization that without her, he and his men would already be dead. Chapter 17. The aftermath of the ambush lingered as the group pushed deeper into the forest. The men walked with slower steps, their usual chatter replaced with an uneasy silence. Rune moved at the edge of the formation, silent as ever, but Gideon noticed the stiffness in her movements. She was tired, though she would never admit it. The weight of her power, the destruction it had caused, seemed to hang over her like a shadow. Gideon wrestled with conflicting thoughts, and his mission demanded that he deliver her. But each time she unleashed her strength to protect them, the lines blurred. He reminded himself that she was dangerous, yet the memory of her lullaby whispered otherwise. That night, they camped near a river, the sound of rushing water offering little comfort. Gideon sat apart from the men, sharpening his blade, when Rune approached. She carried herself with her usual calm, though her eyes betrayed weariness. "They fear me," she said simply, nodding toward the soldiers who avoided her gaze. Gideon didn't deny it. They should. Rune tilted her head at him, studying him as though his words amused her. "And you? Do you fear me?" Gideon hesitated, the scrape of steel against stone pausing for a moment before he answered, "I fear what you could do." Rune's lips curved faintly. "That is not the same as fearing me." The following day, their journey was interrupted by an encounter with a group of refugees. Women, children, and a handful of wounded men stumbled onto the road, their clothes torn and faces marked with exhaustion. The soldiers stiffened, hands on their weapons, but Rune stepped forward before Gideon could react. She knelt beside a child with a bloodied arm, whispering softly as she cleaned the wound with water. The boy stared at her wide-eyed, fear slowly softening into trust. Gideon watched in silence, conflicted. Rune was a witch, the enemy, yet in that moment, she was something else entirely. The soldiers shifted uneasily, seeing the contradiction unfold before their eyes. Later, as the group moved on, Gideon confronted her. "Why did you help them? They're nothing to you." Rune's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Because once, I was that child. And because if you strip away the banners and the swords, what are we, if not the same?" Her words unsettled him, digging into places he had long buried beneath duty and loyalty. He wanted to argue, to remind her that witches and men were not the same. But the memory of the child's face silenced him. For the first time, he questioned whether the Republic's war was as simple as it had always seemed. The soldiers grew restless as days passed. Whispers of betrayal crept into the campfires, muttered behind Gideon's back. Some of them wondered aloud if Rune was leading them into danger, if her magic was more curse than blessing. Gideon quelled the doubts with sharp words and sharper stares, but he knew their trust was fraying. At night, he caught himself staring at Rune, trying to read the truth in her expression. Was she an ally or enemy? He found no answers, only more questions. Rune, for her part, gave him nothing. She carried herself with quiet composure, though her eyes sometimes lingered on him longer than before, as though she could see through the walls he had built. One evening, as they made camp beneath a canopy of trees, Rune sat beside the fire, her face lit by the flickering glow. Gideon joined her, the silence between them stretching until she broke it. "Do you ever wonder if the Republic is worth all this blood?" she asked softly. Gideon stiffened, torn between honesty and the reflex of loyalty. "It's my duty," he answered. Rune studied him for a moment, then said, "Duty is not the same as truth." The words stung more than he wanted to admit. leaving him restless long after she turned away. The tension between them was no longer one of simple mistrust. It had shifted into something more complicated, a pull Gideon could not name. Rune's presence gnawed at him, not just because of her power, but because she forced him to see the world through different eyes. Each passing day brought them closer to the edge of something inevitable, whether it was betrayal, salvation, or something far more dangerous. And though he would not speak it aloud, Gideon felt the ground shifting beneath him, pulling him toward a path he could not yet see. Chapter 18. The company pressed onward through rugged terrain where jagged rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The air grew colder as they climbed, and the men muttered complaints under their breath. Rune walked with her head high, the wind tugging at her cloak, her presence both isolating and commanding. Gideon kept her in his sight at all times, not because he distrusted her less, but because her nearness steadied him in a way he refused to admit. He felt torn between his loyalty to the Republic and the undeniable proof that without Rune, none of them would have survived the last attack. Every step forward left him more aware of the dangerous line he walked. By midday, they came upon the remnants of a burned village. Charred beams stuck out from the earth, and ash coated the ground where homes had once stood. The men fell silent, their gazes sweeping over the devastation. Rune knelt to touch the scorched soil, her expression unreadable. "This is the Republic's work," she said softly, almost to herself. Gideon's jaw clenched, but he offered no reply. One of the younger soldiers spat at the ground, muttering, "If witches had stayed in their place, none of this would have happened." Rune turned her head slowly, her eyes locking on him, and the soldier faltered under her stare. Gideon intervened sharply, silencing any further words, but the weight of accusation lingered in the air. That night, the memory of the ruined village hung over them. Gideon found himself sitting apart from the others, his back against a fallen log, when Rune approached. She held a small flame in her palm, its glow flickering like a captured star. Without a word, she placed it in front of him, letting the light chase back the darkness. "Fire can destroy," she said quietly, "but it can also protect." Gideon studied her, torn between skepticism and fascination. "And which are you?" he asked. Rune closed her hand, extinguishing the flame. "That depends on you." The exchange left him unsettled, unable to shake the sense that she had given him more than just an answer. The following day tested them again. Scouts returned with news of enemy riders approaching fast, and Gideon ordered the group to prepare for a skirmish. Rune stood at his side, calm where others trembled. When the clash came, it was brutal and swift. Arrows rained down, blades clashed, and the cries of wounded men filled the air. Gideon fought with practiced ferocity, cutting through foes with grim determination. Rune's power flared beside him, her spells striking with precision that left even hardened soldiers in awe. For a fleeting moment, they moved as one, their strengths woven together like threads in the same tapestry. When the dust settled, the enemy lay scattered, their retreat hastened by fear of Rune's sorcery. The soldiers gathered themselves, shaken but alive. Gideon turned to find Rune leaning against a tree, her breathing uneven. He approached her cautiously. "You pushed yourself too far," he said. Rune smirked faintly, her voice edged with weariness. "Better me than them." Gideon wanted to argue but found no words. Instead, he handed her his water skin, and to his surprise, she accepted it without protest. Their hands brushed in the exchange, and the brief touch lingered longer in his mind than it should have. The men, once wary of her, began to view Rune with reluctant respect. Whispers spread that perhaps the witch was not their enemy after all, though none dared say it too loudly. Gideon saw the shift, but did not comment. He knew trust could unravel as quickly as it formed. Rune, however, seemed untouched by their changing views. She walked among them with the same quiet composure, her eyes always on the horizon, as though she carried knowledge of a future none of them could see. Gideon wondered if she was guiding them toward safety, or deeper into danger. The question haunted him, but he could not let it go unanswered. That evening, as the campfires burned low, Rune sat near the edge of the camp, her gaze fixed on the stars above. Gideon found himself drawn to her side, despite his better judgment. After a long silence, he asked, "What do you see when you look at the sky like that?" Rune's answer was simple, yet heavy with meaning. "I see freedom. The stars cannot be chained by kings or soldiers." Gideon followed her gaze, the weight of her words pressing into him. For the first time, he wondered if the freedom she spoke of was something he secretly longed for too. Chapter 19. The march resumed at dawn, the sky painted with streaks of pale gold and gray. The soldiers walked in silence, their boots crunching over frost and stone. Rune kept her hood up, her figure a quiet shadow among them, yet Gideon noticed how the men no longer gave her such a wide berth. They watched her warily, yes, but also with something bordering on curiosity, as though uncertain whether to fear or rely on her. Gideon felt the same conflict thrumming inside him. He told himself it was dangerous to forget what she was, yet he could not deny that her presence had saved them time and again. Each mile brought the gnawing question closer. Was she becoming an ally, or a threat wrapped in the shape of one? By mid-morning, they reached a forested pass, where towering pines swayed and whispered with the wind. Here, Rune paused, her hand brushing the bark of an ancient tree. Gideon noticed her lips moving faintly, as though she spoke to something unseen. When he drew closer, her voice became audible. "The forest remembers," she murmured. "Every fire, every blade, every drop of blood spilled." Gideon frowned. "Trees do not speak." Rune turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you simply do not listen." He wanted to dismiss her words as superstition. Yet part of him wondered what truths lay beyond his soldier's understanding. He followed her deeper into the woods, unsettled but unable to walk away. Trouble found them before the day was out. A band of deserters, ragged and half-starved, descended upon the company, desperate for food and supplies. Gideon gave the order to defend, and steel rang once more. The deserters fought like men with nothing to lose, fierce and unrelenting. Rune unleashed her magic in controlled bursts, each spell turning the tide without consuming her strength, as it had before. Gideon fought beside her, his blade flashing in the dim light, and for a fleeting moment the world narrowed to the rhythm of their survival. When the last deserter fled into the trees, silence returned, broken only by the heavy breaths of the living. In the aftermath, one of the younger soldiers, bloodied but alive, looked at Rune with awe rather than suspicion. "If she had not been here, we would be dead," he muttered. The words spread quickly among the ranks, unspoken, but heavy with truth. Gideon noted the shift, though he remained cautious. He remembered too well how fear could twist into worship, and worship into betrayal. Rune herself seemed untouched by their whispers. She bound her wounds with quiet efficiency, her eyes distant, as though her thoughts wandered beyond the battle. Gideon wondered what shadows lingered in her mind, and if she carried burdens she would never voice. That evening, The camp settled in uneasy quiet. Gideon found Rune apart from the others, her gaze fixed on the fire. He sat across from her, the flames casting shifting patterns across her face. "Why do you fight with us?" he asked suddenly. Rune did not look away from the fire. "Because your war burns my world too. If I do nothing, everything I love will be ash." Gideon studied her, hearing the echo of truth in her tone. Yet he could not shake the sense that her reasons ran deeper, rooted in secrets she would not share. Still, her answer stirred something in him, a recognition that perhaps their paths were not so different after all. The night deepened, and with it came an uneasy stillness. The forest around them seemed to listen, every rustle of leaves magnified by the quiet. Gideon kept watch, his hand on the hilt of his sword, while Rune remained seated, her eyes closed, as though listening to a rhythm beyond human hearing. When he asked what she was doing, she replied simply, "Feeling for danger." Hours passed, and no enemy came. Yet Gideon realized he trusted her warning more than his own vigilance. That truth unsettled him, and he wondered when reliance had begun to replace suspicion. As dawn broke, Rune rose first, her silhouette framed against the pale light. Gideon watched her, knowing she was no ordinary companion, and perhaps never would be. Yet something had shifted between them in those long hours, the faintest thread of trust, fragile but undeniable. He tightened his grip on his sword, as though bracing himself for the path ahead. Whatever awaited them, he knew that Rune was both shield and storm, salvation and danger bound in one. And though he told himself he should fear it, he could not look away. Chapter 20. The morning after the skirmish dawned colder than before, a biting wind threading through the pines and carrying with it the scent of frost. Gideon ordered the men to break camp quickly, his voice clipped, though his thoughts lingered on Rune. She had already risen, her movements deliberate, her cloak brushing the ground as she secured her few belongings. He found himself watching her without meaning to, how she seemed both part of the wilderness and apart from it, a figure too sharp, too alive, to be mistaken for an ordinary ally. He told himself again that she was dangerous, yet the quiet way the soldiers fell in line after her presence was undeniable. She had become an anchor they hadn't realized they needed. As the company wound deeper into the forest path, silence stretched between Gideon and Rune. He finally broke it, his tone measured. "You fight like someone who has been hunted all her life." Rune's eyes flicked to him, dark and unreadable. "Perhaps I have." The answer was neither admission nor denial, and Gideon felt its weight settle on him. He wanted to press her, to unravel the web she wove around herself. But a part of him understood that trust was not built with questions. So instead, he walked beside her in silence, letting her words hang in the air like mist. By midday, they reached the remnants of an old watchtower, half swallowed by vines and moss. Gideon called for a halt, knowing the men needed rest. Rune drifted toward the structure, her fingers brushing the weathered stone. "This place has seen death," she said softly, her voice carrying a distant sorrow. Gideon joined her, frowning at the ruins. "Every battlefield has," he replied. Rune shook her head. "Not just battles, executions, betrayal, fear that bled into the walls." She turned her gaze on him, and for a moment he thought she could see straight through him, into every hidden memory he had tried to bury. He looked away first, unsettled by how she could make stone and silence feel alive. Their rest was cut short by the sudden crack of branches nearby. Instantly Gideon's sword was drawn, and Rune's hand glowed faintly with the shimmer of restrained power. From the shadows emerged not enemies, but refugees, ragged families with hollow cheeks and eyes too old for their years. The soldiers tensed, yet Gideon held up his hand, signaling restraint. Rune stepped forward before he could speak, kneeling to the level of a frightened child, clutching his mother's skirts. She murmured something soft, and the boy's trembling eased. Gideon felt the men watching, their suspicion of her warring with the undeniable sight of her gentleness. It struck him then that Rune was not only a weapon, and that she was a protector, though she would never call herself one. Later, when the refugees had been given food and guided away, Gideon confronted Rune quietly. "Why do you care?" he asked. "They're strangers. They owe you nothing." Rune's gaze lingered on the fading path the families had taken. "Because once, I was no one's responsibility either. And if someone had turned me away, I would not be standing here." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than Gideon expected. For the first time, he wondered if beneath the layers of danger and magic, she was a reflection of everything he had tried to forget about himself, of mercy left unspoken. That night, the campfire burned low, and the men slept in uneasy heaps. Gideon found Rune seated apart again, her hood down, the flames catching in her hair. He sat near her without speaking, letting the quiet stretch. After a while, she glanced at him. "You watch me as though waiting for me to break." Gideon did not deny it. "Because if you do, the rest of us won't survive." Rune studied him for a long moment, then gave the faintest smile, tinged with weariness. "Then pray, I don't." The fragile honesty in her tone struck him harder than any blade could. Before dawn, when the world was still hushed, Gideon woke to find Rune already awake, standing at the edge of camp, with her cloak drawn tight. The first rays of light caught her profile, sharp and unyielding. For a fleeting moment, Gideon thought of her not as a witch, not as a danger, but as something far rarer, an ally forged in fire, one whose presence he had come to rely on more than he dared admit. The thought unsettled him, and yet he did not look away. Chapter 21. The next day began under a shroud of unease, as the group pressed deeper into contested territory. The forest thinned into rocky plains, where the wind carried the distant clang of metal and smoke. They soon realized why. A skirmish had broken out ahead between Imperial scouts and a band of rebels, the clash spilling across the road they were meant to take. Gideon ordered the company to hold formation, while Rune stepped forward with sharp focus, her senses straining to read the shifting tide of the battle. Though outnumbered, the rebels fought with desperate fury, and for the first time, Gideon's soldiers saw the cost of war up close, the kind that left both sides bloodied with no real victory. Gideon made a swift decision, commanding his men to intervene. The soldiers crashed into the fray with trained precision, cutting through Imperial scouts to break the deadlock. Rune did not hang back. With a flick of her hand, she redirected a spear mid-flight, saving a rebel who would have fallen. The rebels stared in awe and fear at her display of power, unsure whether to thank her or brand her a threat. When the dust settled, bodies littered the road, and silence descended heavy as a cloak. Both sides had lost fighters, yet Gideon's company had tipped the balance long enough for the rebels to retreat alive. In the aftermath, tensions erupted. Gideon's men questioned whether aiding the rebels would brand them traitors in the eyes of the crown. One soldier demanded to know why they risked their lives for outlaws. Gideon silenced the doubt with his iron tone, reminding them their true mission lay ahead, not in petty allegiances. Still, Rune noticed the flicker of hesitation in Gideon's eyes. She realized he was beginning to weigh not only strategy, but the morality of every choice, and that shift unsettled him more than he would admit. Among the survivors was a rebel scout named Aiden, who approached Gideon cautiously. He warned that Imperial forces had increased their patrols in the region and that the path to the mountain stronghold would be fraught with ambushes. Rune listened intently, her gaze sharp as Aiden spoke of hidden trails and secret watchfires lit at night to signal safe passage. Gideon accepted his guidance reluctantly, wary of the man's motives, but necessity forced his hand. The addition of Aiden into their party stirred unease among the soldiers, who saw in him a mirror of Rune, another outsider whose loyalty was untested. As evening fell, the group set camp near a ridge overlooking the battlefield they had just left behind. The men sat in uneasy silence, haunted by the sight of comrades and enemies alike strewn lifeless across the road. Rune walked among them, offering no words, only the steady presence that seemed to anchor their frayed nerves. One young soldier muttered a prayer, his voice trembling. Rune knelt beside him, her tone low but steady as she said, "The dead are gone, but we carry their weight. Let it make you stronger." Not colder, Gideon overheard, and though he kept his face unreadable, he could not deny the effect her words had on the weary. Later that night, when most of the company slept, Gideon and Rune kept watch together. The conversation turned to the rebels they had aided. Gideon admitted that once he would have struck them down without hesitation, but the lines between enemy and ally had begun to blur. Rune responded quietly, "That is the nature of empires. They draw lines in the dirt, and all of us bleed over them." Her words lingered with him long after, sharpening the conflict in his own heart. For the first time, Gideon wondered whether his loyalty was to the empire or to the people trapped beneath its rule. By dawn, their path was set toward the hidden trails Aiden had described. But the company carried more than supplies with them. They bore the scars of the battle they had intervened in, the doubts of soldiers who no longer knew who they fought for, and the subtle but growing influence of Rune, who stood not as their commander, but as a figure they instinctively looked toward in the quiet moments. The journey ahead was darker, the dangers sharper. Yet what lingered most was the unspoken truth that every step drew them deeper into a war of choices that would not be undone. Chapter 22. The march into the mountain pass was difficult, the rocky path forcing everyone to move in single file while keeping watch for danger. Rune could feel the tension among the soldiers as every step echoed too loudly against the cliffs. The air was thin, and even the seasoned fighters were struggling to breathe steadily. Aiden moved at the front, guiding them with confidence, but also a trace of unease that Rune quickly noticed. She realized that even though he was leading them, he was wary of what lay ahead. The unease was justified when Gideon called for the group to halt. A faint sound drifted down from the ridge above them, the metallic scrape of weapons being drawn. In a heartbeat, arrows began raining from the rocks, and shouts filled the pass as Imperial soldiers revealed themselves. The attackers had chosen their ground well, with high vantage points and limited room for the company to maneuver. Gideon wasted no time in giving sharp orders, his voice cutting through the chaos as he directed his men to shields and cover. Rune, unarmed and untrained in such combat, crouched close to the stone wall and scanned the battlefield for any chance to act. Aiden moved swiftly, proving his knowledge of these passes was more than just guiding paths. He shouted for them to press forward toward a narrow cleft, insisting that remaining pinned would be certain death. Soldiers followed his lead, raising shields to protect Rune as arrows clattered off the stone. Gideon's sword was soon drawn, his movements precise and deadly as he cut down the first wave of Imperials that dared descend. Rune could not look away, caught between fear and awe at how he commanded both the battlefield and his men. The clash turned fierce when Imperial soldiers closed in hand to hand. The confined space gave advantage to strength and discipline, both of which Gideon's men carried. Rune caught sight of one soldier who nearly broke through the line, his blade raised high toward her. For a breathless instant, she froze. Aiden struck from the side, driving his dagger home and pulling her back before the man could strike. Her heart pounded at how close death had come, and she realized once more how fragile her survival was in this world of constant war. The rebels pushed harder, spurred on by Gideon's relentless pace. He fought like a man unwilling to yield even an inch of ground, each strike clearing space for his men to follow. Rune noticed the respect his soldiers had for him in those moments, how they obeyed without hesitation. She also saw that his eyes never left the ridges, always searching for threats above. When the Imperials began to retreat, she knew it was because they could not break his defense, not because they lacked numbers. Once the danger lessened, the company pressed into the cleft Aiden had pointed out. It was narrow, forcing them to squeeze through, but it opened into a small hollow surrounded by stone. Gideon ordered a brief rest, his tone clipped but steady. Rune sank against the rock, her body trembling from the adrenaline that still pulsed through her. Gideon checked the wounded, speaking firmly to keep spirits from falling. Aiden remained at the edge of the hollow, listening for signs of pursuit. His eyes told Rune what he would not say aloud. The Imperials were not finished, and the pass ahead would hold more danger. Though exhausted, Rune could not shake the memory of the near strike that might have ended her life. She glanced at Gideon, who was binding a soldier's wound with steady hands, and realized once again how strange her place among them was. She was neither soldier nor true ally, yet her fate was tied to theirs more tightly with each battle. As night settled over the hollow, the sounds of the wounded, the crackle of small fires, and the distant howl of wind reminded her that survival in this war demanded more than courage. It demanded trust, and trust was a fragile thing among people who had every reason to question her. Chapter 23. The hollow in the mountains offered little comfort, and by dawn, the company was already preparing to move. The soldiers were weary, but Gideon pushed them forward, knowing that lingering too long would only invite another Imperial ambush. Rune walked near the middle of the group, keeping close to the men who shielded her, though she could feel their suspicious glances. She understood that many still doubted her place among them, whispering questions about why a witch should be protected when so many of their own had fallen in battle. The tension was a constant reminder that she was walking a fine line between survival and hostility. Aiden guided them through a twisting series of paths, claiming these routes would avoid the main Imperial patrols. Rune noticed how he never moved without caution, stopping often to study the rocks and listen to the silence. His instincts saved them once more when he led them into a dry gully just moments before Imperial riders thundered past on the ridge above. The company crouched low, breaths held, until the hoofbeats faded into the distance. Rune found herself watching Gideon in that moment, his hand gripping his sword hilt, but his eyes steady, ready to act if needed. It was that calm strength that steadied the men as much as any shield. The march that followed grew harsher. The ground climbed steeply, and loose stones threatened to send them tumbling with every step. Soldiers muttered under their breath, some blaming Aiden for leading them into cursed terrain, others swearing that no path was worth such punishment. Rune listened in silence, aware that division within the ranks could be as deadly as an enemy's sword. When Gideon finally barked at them to keep moving, his voice carried enough authority to silence the complaints. It was clear he would not tolerate disobedience, no matter how harsh the journey became. By midday, they reached a plateau that offered a wide view of the valley below. The sight froze them all. Smoke rose from a distant village, dark and heavy against the sky. Rune felt her stomach twist as she realized what that meant. The Imperials had already passed through, leaving destruction in their wake. Some of the soldiers cursed under their breath. Others stared in silence at the sight of homes burning. Gideon's expression hardened, though he gave no outward sign of emotion. Rune thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps anger, perhaps grief, but it vanished quickly as he ordered the company to move on. When they reached the ruins later that day, the destruction was worse up close. Houses were blackened shells, livestock slaughtered, and the air reeked of smoke and ash. Rune walked among the wreckage with a heavy heart, her fingers brushing over the charred wood of a doorway that once led into someone's home. The silence of the dead pressed down on the group, broken only when they discovered a few survivors hiding among the ruins. The villagers were shaken, many injured, and all fearful. They spoke of Imperial soldiers who had demanded supplies before setting fire to everything they could not take. The soldiers wanted to stay and help, but Gideon reminded them of their mission. Supplies were shared, wounds tended quickly, but he would not allow his company to linger. Rune disagreed inwardly, anger burning in her chest at the thought of leaving these people behind. But she also understood the danger. To remain too long would bring the Imperials back down upon them. She caught Gideon's eye once, wanting to argue, but the set of his jaw told her the decision was final. It was a reminder that his duty was not to sentiment, but to the Republic and the mission they carried. As they left the ruined village, Rune walked in silence, her heart heavy with what she had seen. Aiden kept pace beside her, his voice low as he muttered that this was why their fight mattered. His words stirred something in her, a deepening of the anger she already carried. Gideon walked ahead, a silent figure of command, but Rune's thoughts lingered on the burned homes, the survivors left behind, and the question of how much more blood would be spilled before this war was over. Chapter 24. The company pressed onward after leaving the burned village behind, but the memory of smoke and ruin clung to them like a shadow. Rune could sense the soldiers' unease, their glances sharper and their voices lower. The weight of what they had seen gnawed at their spirits. Aiden spoke little, though his eyes scanned every ridge and slope, searching for signs of danger. Gideon walked at the head, his silence heavier than words. Rune found herself wondering if the destruction of the village had shaken him more than he let on, though his face gave nothing away. The mountain path narrowed again, forcing them into a line that wound between high cliffs. The sound of rushing water echoed ahead, and soon they came upon a river cutting across their way. The current was strong, swollen by snowmelt, and the only crossing was a broken rope bridge swaying dangerously in the wind. Some soldiers muttered that it was madness to cross, but Aiden insisted it was the only way forward. Gideon inspected the ropes and boards himself before making the decision. They would cross, one by one, with shields raised in case of attack. Rune felt her stomach tighten as she stepped toward the swaying bridge, the drop below dizzying. Crossing was slow and tense. The boards creaked under each step, and the wind howled through the gorge. Rune clutched the ropes tightly, her heart racing with every movement. Behind her, a soldier muttered a prayer under his breath, his fear plain in his voice. When she reached the far side, relief washed through her, but it was short-lived. Shouts rang out from the cliffs above, and arrows began to rain down once more. The Imperials had been waiting, and the soldiers still on the bridge were now easy targets. Chaos erupted. One of the ropes snapped under the weight of too many men, sending part of the bridge lurching dangerously. A soldier screamed as he fell, his voice echoing through the gorge before silence claimed him. Gideon bellowed orders from the far side, urging the men to cross faster while shields were raised against the arrows. Rune crouched low, searching for any way to help. She spotted Aiden scrambling up the rocks, dagger in hand, moving like a shadow toward the archers above. His speed and ferocity turned the tide, distracting the attackers long enough for the rest of the company to cross. By the time the soldiers regrouped on the far side, several were dead, and more were wounded. The bridge was destroyed behind them, leaving no way back. Gideon's jaw was tight as he checked the losses, his words clipped and sharp as he reassured the men that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Rune's chest ached at the sight of their pain, at the exhaustion on their faces. These were not nameless soldiers to her anymore. Each death weighed heavier, a reminder that the war claimed lives one by one, without mercy. They made camp not far from the gorge, their fires hidden beneath rock outcroppings to avoid detection. The wounded were treated as best as possible, though supplies were running low. Rune helped where she could, offering comfort more than skill, though her presence was still met with suspicion by some. Aiden returned late, blood on his blade and dirt smeared across his face. He said little of what he had done, only that the cliffs were clear. Rune saw the hardness in his eyes, the cost of killing etched there, though he hid it behind silence. As night fell, Rune found herself staring into the flames, her thoughts restless. Gideon sat apart, sharpening his blade with steady, practiced strokes. His presence seemed unshakable, yet she could not ignore the weariness in his posture when he thought no one was watching. Aiden sat nearby, quiet but alert, his eyes never leaving the shadows. Surrounded by men sworn to fight, Rune felt caught between two worlds, a witch who should have been their enemy, and yet was bound to their cause. The day's battle and the lives lost reminded her once again that there was no turning back, only the uncertain path ahead. This has been the summary of Rebel Witch, The Crimson Moth, Book 2, summarized by Cellwave Audio and narrated by Bill.